It is such a pleasure to be with you today. I'm excited to be here. Rochester's Summit to End Hate is coming at such a critical time, not only in the Rochester area, but for the country as well. And I'll speak a little bit about that. I speak to you today from Portland, Oregon, where dark cloud and smoke has surrounded not only the city, not only the county, but the entire region from California to Washington. That dark smoke in this moment feels like it might not go away. We wonder, when will it leave? And I want to come back to that analogy of smoke because it describes the moment that I think all of us are feeling and experiencing right now. We look around our nation and we wonder, how did we become so divided? When did we stop with the ability to communicate with one another? How do we change the course and send the smoke elsewhere? My story starts in Long Beach, California. As a teenager, I went to school, public school in Long Beach at the time of desegregation. That meant being bused to a different city school that was about 45 minutes to an hour away. But busing meant a city bus and a city pass. And riding the city bus meant then walking another 3 to 5 blocks to my school. I was a 7th grader then. And walking that 3 or 4 blocks every day meant being the victim of racial abuse and harassment. Adults who would drive around in their car saying things like, "Go back to Africa," screaming monkey, ape, and other words that you can likely imagine. Imagine a 7th grader being hit with that type of abuse every day. Being a pre-teenager is difficult enough. Most people in 7th grade don't want to be seen. You don't want to be noticed. You don't want to stand out. Neither did I. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my teachers. I didn't tell a school administrator. I kept what happened to me for 3 years to myself. It happened so much that I just thought it was normal. And it wasn't just me. It happened to dozens of students every day, hundreds of students every day, thousands of students every day. How do we know? Because we know the statistics. I could spend the next 20 minutes talking to you about how race impacts us, whether we were talking about health, education, the arts, or other places. Sounds like folks are having a hard time seeing me right now, but I do want to let you know that my video is on, so I'm gonna continue to speak right now, and sorry for any technical difficulties that may be happening. I want to say really quickly, moving on, that level of hate has an impact on a society. It alienates communities from one another. It brings us to a point of not being able to find a way forward. So what do we do? Well, my story, I think, does provide some insight. Eventually, one day in 9th grade, a bunch of us were waiting for the city bus to take us home. And a pickup truck drove by, and individuals began shouting out in the car. They were probably college students. One of my friends shouted something back and may have even thrown something back. And I remember the pickup truck screeching to a halt and these college students piling out and running at us. I decided in that moment that I wasn't going to run anymore, that I didn't want to be bullied. I shared this story because it's important for us to know that ultimately, to confront bigotry and hate, we have to stop running and we have to hold our ground. And standing our ground doesn't mean being violent. Standing our ground doesn't mean being vicious. Standing our ground means standing with one another. That's what I chose to do that day, and that's the value that has carried me through the rest of my life. Eventually, I moved to Eugene, Oregon. Now, I didn't know much about Eugene, Oregon. My friends asked me if I wanted to move up. Two of them were going to the University of Oregon, and these were close friends. We had been friends throughout high school. We played music together. We hung out all the time. We really enjoyed each other's company. These were my best friends. So you can imagine when they asked me if I wanted to move to Eugene, Oregon, I looked them deeply in the eyes with the love a friend has for one another, and I said to them, hell no. Why would I ever move to Eugene, Oregon? And I'm fairly sure I didn't say Oregon, but probably Oregon. If you could have looked in my brain at that moment, what you would have seen was San Francisco, a lot of trees, and the Space Needle, which wasn't even in Oregon, but in Seattle, Washington. I had no conception of what Oregon looked like. And because I had no conception, I relied on stereotypes and things that I made up to fill in gaps in information. That's often what we do with bigotry in our society. Whether it's the behavioral acts of things we say or believe, or whether we are talking about the organized bigotry and hatred of the white nationalist movement or other social movements grounded in exclusion. When we don't have information, when we don't have connection, that is when our biases are at most risk of hurting others. I remember, embarrassingly enough, asking my friends at that time if Eugene, Oregon had running water or if it had electricity. Was there a McDonald's? Was there cable? I can laugh at that now, but I wasn't saying those things to throw shade or to make fun. I just had no information. I remember that the closest I could think that Eugene, Oregon might look like was from the show Little House on the Prairie. Again, showing because I had no information, I relied on stereotypes that were buried in the back of my mind. Even as I read the catalog from their school, the University of Oregon, which described the city, I could not equate the facts I was reading with the myths in my head. And that's the danger of prejudice in our society, that it's left unchecked, it is left unchanged. And that simply receiving information is not enough to change stereotypes. So I want to reflect a little bit more on what I learned. As I moved to Eugene, Oregon, because ultimately I did move, and it was the best decision that I ever made. I was smart to ignore my biases and the myths that were playing around in my head. Moving to Eugene, Oregon probably saved my life, and it's allowed me to help a lot of people. I often wonder what happens to us when we allow bias to control our lives, when we allow the fear of myths, the idea of African Americans as criminals, or Latinos as undeserving in our society, or the gay and lesbian or trans community, or women, or religious minorities. It doesn't just impact those communities, but it impacts all of us. It denies us creativity, and it denies us talent. We are in a serious moment in this nation. We are all familiar with the attacks in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, or the Walmart in El Paso targeting Latinos, or the murder in an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, or the targeting of Sikhs in Wisconsin. Hate is among us, and hate isn't just an attitude, but comes with it violence, intimidation, and fear. The white nationalist movement is the largest significant threat in the United States today. But let's be clear, the white nationalist movement doesn't bring its anti-Semitism and racism into our communities. It simply organizes the bigotry that already exists. The way that we ultimately counter the white nationalist movement is both by standing up to it morally, but doing the hard work every day of ensuring that they cannot take advantage of the unconscious bias and inequalities in our community. 3 years ago, there was a large white nationalist rally in Portland, Oregon. It was outside a blues festival. Why? Because like us, they are also organizers. They understood there would be a lot of people coming in and out of that blues festival. They planned it around 5 o'clock when they knew local media would start to run live footage from the protest into the homes of families around Portland, Oregon, who would then see Nazis, counter-protesters, and police facing off against one another. They understood the propaganda value of what they were doing. But I reflect on another story that happened under that umbrella. I observed a young man in his 20s who was a white nationalist or alt-right supporter. He was standing and over around off the side of the protest. And there was another person who was holding a digital camera, straight in his face, yelling questions at him, saying, "Why are you here? Why are you here? No one wants you here," right? The mayor doesn't want you here. These protesters don't want you here. Why are you here? And the white nationalist activist responded with a smile on his face. He responded to the person holding the camera. He said, "Yes, I've heard you don't want us here. But the truth of the matter is that the city of Portland is shrinking its Black population by both percentage and whole number." He basically said, virtually, literally, the Black population of Portland, Oregon is disappearing. He then looked at the cameraman and he said, "So you can say you don't want us here, but you are doing something we could never do. You are literally disappearing the Black population of Portland." And he smiled and he walked away. In short, he was calling us all hypocrites. And it was a warning sign that if we do not deal with the real inequalities in our societies, in our communities, we will not effectively be able to respond to this white nationalist threat. Hate crimes are one way that we can respond. Responding to hate crimes is critically important in our communities. Hate crimes seek to isolate not only individuals, but an entire community because of their race, religion, gender, sexual identity, orientation. Hate crimes are a form of social alienation that, left unchecked, will rip communities apart. Now, there are two types of hate crimes. There are the reactionary hate crimes that come from spur-of-the-moment bigotry or an individual who feels that they've lost their house or their job. And there are the mission-oriented hate crimes that occur at the hands of white nationalists or others targeting the Jewish community, African Americans, Native Americans, and others. These mission-oriented hate crimes are very terrible. And within the white nationalist movement and others, increasingly they are driven by anti-Semitism. Responding to hate crimes means quickly rendering assistance to the individuals who have been targeted, communicating with those communities, providing resources, making sure law enforcement takes it seriously and is trained to understand what hate crimes are, and pursuing civil penalties where possible. Hate crimes cannot be prevented, but hate crimes can be reduced through education and through ensuring that those who commit hate crimes are held accountable. And I don't mean just criminalization. We overly rely on criminalization. What I mean is by ensuring that those who commit hate crimes are involved in restitutions that actually bring the community back together. In terms of mission-oriented hate crimes, It's imperative that we understand the white nationalist movement. I share this in this moment, the importance of dealing with discrimination within institutions and the hate violence of white nationalists and others, because they are the twin challenges right now. They're the challenges that keep our communities from coming together and uniting around some of the complex conversations and issues that we face today. Whether we are talking about rising unemployment, where over 50 million Americans are out of work, or a spreading COVID-19 pandemic in our nation. These are real issues that must be contended with. But to contend with them means building communities that understand that building a community for a different world is essential today, and it starts through breaking down the isolation we feel among one another. In short, I want to tell you all something. There is no rule book on how we do this. There is no plan. We have never, ever created the multiracial, multi-religious society that is called the United States of America. It is not unique, but it is rare. And for it to be a multiracial democracy makes it rarer still. We don't know how this is supposed to work. It's an experiment that has never been done before. But experiments mean we have to be willing to try and willing to make mistakes. We don't learn to run by running. We learn to run by falling down. And we need to build social movements for equity that allow for more failures. Failures are important because they are how we learn. But to fail means that you first have to try. You have to try something. You have to do one thing now. There are many in the society right now using anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry to drive wedges in our community. They want us to believe that we haven't won. But I'm here to tell you today, we have won. We have built the inclusive democracy, and the work before us is no longer about building it, but actualizing it. But often, these dark clouds of exclusion want us to believe that we are being defeated. And they want us to believe that these clouds, that the smoke won't pass. Why? Because they don't want us to be ready for when they do. But I'm here to tell you today that those clouds will pass. The smoke will lift. And when they do, we have to be communities that know how to lean into one another, to have hard and difficult conversations, to disagree, to understand that the values that we hold are more important than our ideology or political party. That this isn't about left versus right, conservative versus liberal, Democrat versus Republican. This is about inclusion versus exclusion. When I was a kid back in Long Beach, I grew up very poor, and so did those around me. Summer was 3 months. So by the time we rolled into August, we were out of things to do. Our parents were likely working, and if they weren't working, they didn't want us running inside their houses anymore. So we would find ourselves outside and usually trying to think of games. And we came up with a game called If I Were. We'd sit in a circle on the concrete, and one person would start off, if I were. And then they lay out a scenario. If I were in the middle of a lion's cage and the lion got out, here's what I would do. Or if I were driving down the freeway and the brakes went out, here's what I would do. The one that would always get brought up every year was, if I were in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement, here's what I would do. And boy, would we argue about what we would or wouldn't do. We didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents. We didn't understand the reality of Jim Crow. We didn't understand the impact of legalized white supremacy in America. Kids, 10, 11, we were full of bravado about what we would do and wouldn't do. That question has always haunted me. What would I have done in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement? Well, at a time where white nationalists are on the march utilizing violence, that there are those who choose to rip our communities apart by grounding themselves in exclusion and nihilism rather than unity and inclusion. At a time when COVID rages across our country, where 1 in 1,125 Black people have died from COVID in the last 5 months alone. I'll say that again, where 1 in 1,125 Black people has perished from COVID-19 in the last 5 months alone. Record unemployment and climate disaster. I'm here to tell you, we no longer have to ask ourselves what we would have done in the 1960s civil rights movement. We no longer have to imagine. The truth is this: whatever it is we would have done in the 1960s civil rights movement, it is what we will do when we leave this conference today. It is time for us to lead. If you believe in a democracy that is people-centered, that is accountable and transparent, it is time for you to stop running. If you believe in a future where our children get to be their best selves, not blocked by discrimination based off of disabilities, off of race, religion, where they don't have to live in fear, it is time to stop running. If you believe that regardless of whether you are a 70-year-old white male veteran in rural America or a 17-year-old trans Latina in urban America, that they have the fundamental right to live, love, work free from fear and bigotry, it is time to stop running. It is time for us to join together. It is time for those of us who believe in a better America to govern. And if we are not prepared, we will not be prepared for the win that the generations before us have sacrificed to bring to us. If we do not prepare, we will not be prepared to help our children actualize the reality of an inclusive democracy in America. This is our time to prepare. That is what you will all do today. And I wish you well. And I look forward to marching with you, virtually, physically, in Congress, in our homes, for the world that we all deserve to live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate you. We have several questions that I want to pose to you, and I'm going to actually, sorry, not look at the camera, but look down to pose them. So the first question I have is, I'm concerned about the militias that seem to be an outgrowth of the white nationalist movement. Can you speak to this threat?
Yes. Currently in the country, folks may be familiar with the rise of armed vigilantes and paramilitary organizations, such as Oath Keepers, Three Presenters. Some are unarmed, like Patriot Prayer. These vigilante groups are not accurately described as militias. Militias are actually a legal forming entity that is actually answerable to authority. What we are seeing around the country are not militias. They are unorganized paramilitary organizations that are acting outside the rule of law. They are not accountable to their communities, and they are driven not by helping individuals, but by sowing decision-making through violence, intimidation, and threats. They are inherently anti-democratic. They have their roots in the 1970s movement called the Posse Comitatus that was actually founded here in Portland, Oregon. The Posse Comitatus briefly taught that there were two types of citizens in America. That there were citizens, the sovereign citizens who derived their rights directly from God, and that there were the 14th Amendment citizens who derived their rights from the Constitution, meaning people of color, women, religious minorities, anyone who isn't defined as a white Christian property owning male, according to Posse Comitatus strategists in the early days. The Posse Comitatus taught that the highest form of authority was the county sheriff. These armed vigilante groups have been active, whether during the farm crisis in the 70s and 80s, during the 90s, in the lead up to the Oklahoma City bombing and other acts of violence, and as a threat to Black Lives Matters. I can point back to Ferguson, where some of these groups were on the ground seeking to intimidate protesters on the streets of Ferguson. These are real organizations. Many of them are violating paramilitary statutes within the states that they are organizing in, particularly around training. And I think the solution is that it's really important in our communities to make sure that we have elected sheriffs or are hiring county sheriffs who actually really believe in democracy and not mob rule, not the threat of violence, that they know that they are accountable to elected, democratically elected leadership, because these armed vigilante and paramilitary groups have been targeting county sheriffs and sheriff's departments for recruitment, at least over the last 5 years, at a very significant level that has had some real impact. Here in Oregon and in California and Washington, in the midst of the wildfires, we have witnessed armed vigilante groups who are actually stopping people who are traveling, right, under their constitutional right to public travel, where they are questioning them, they are interrogating them. We have seen other incidences where actually sheriff deputies provided information to these armed vigilantes about how to avoid getting into legal trouble. It is a very real threat in this country. But what we can say at the end of the day is that anyone participating in protest in this country needs to commit to not bringing weapons or creating physical violence in these demonstrations. It makes it harder to deal and de-escalate the threat of these armed paramilitary groups. But at the end of the day, all of us should be meeting with the heads of law enforcement and our elected officials to work with them to understand what is their plan to deal with these armed paramilitary threats. There is information, Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League, Western State Center at wedefenddemocracy.org. There is information available and resources available for those who are looking to work with elected officials in helping to manage this new threat to democracy.
We have a lot of great questions. So I just want to put another one to you, and keeping an eye on the time at the same time.
Yeah. This
is, what have we learned about how to reduce hate and racism? Marching, protesting, and denouncing can help, but what can be done to reduce racism?
Yeah. So there are 3 specific things we can do. Marching and being verbal is critically important. It's important for folks to visibly be able to understand, particularly when you are a vulnerable community, just how much support you have. And it's hard to judge in a community if you don't see anyone or you don't hear anyone speaking out. You feel like you are alone, and you don't want anyone feeling like they're isolated. So that's critically important. The second piece that's really critically important is I believe it's civil suits for those who commit hate crimes. I think we are over-reliant on criminalization, which I think goes against the values of who we say we are. I'm not saying that there are not instances where criminal charges don't need to be pursued. What I'm saying is we are overly reliant, and civil suits, I think, are another point of engagement. The third, I would just say this: if you ultimately want to reduce hate crimes and bias crimes and racism in your community, the first is you have to document. We have to stop focusing on intent and start focusing on outcomes, right? If there are disparate and disparate outcomes in terms of racial inequality, that tells you that racism exists. Not only does it tell you that racism exists, but it tells you that you haven't created the mechanisms, right, to manage that racism. Racial bias is unlikely to go away in our generation or even the generation afterwards, but it doesn't mean that we can't put in the tools and systems to offset racial bias in our communities. I would recommend for those who are really interested in understanding how to specifically address systemic bias in our society, to look at the website of an organization called raceforward.org. And raceforward.org has some of the strongest workshops for individuals and community leaders who are looking for specific tools on dismantling racial inequality in their communities, how to measure for it, and how to do it in a way that is productive, that isn't reliant on personal grievance, but is focused on system change, because it's system change that really matters.
Thanks, Eric. My next question for you is, I would like to hear more about what it takes or what it means to take risks in our movements for equity and what it looks like to make room to try and to fail.
Yeah. So we are not movements that have created space for that. And in fact, some would argue that we've done the opposite, that we've created so many tests of purity, right? Right speak, right form, that it's nearly impossible to find a place in the movement, right? We hear, conversations and debates around call-in and call-out culture. I don't think those are actually accurate descriptions, but they point to something, which is that we've created so much fear of failure inside of our social movements, that we've used, pointing out people in a way that drives people out rather than drives people in, that there's a fundamental change that has to happen within our movements. So if we really want to create a culture where folks can take risk and fail, right? Because failure, I'm going to say it again, failure is critically important. I think we have to do several things. The first is we have to be much more humble, right? And we have to understand that if we are actually winning, what winning means metaphorically is we are standing at the top of the mountain right now. We're not climbing the mountain anymore, right? We're actually standing at the top of the mountain and we are looking over into the promised land. I believe that is where we are right now. But here's the catch. We don't get into the promised land unless we all go together. And going together means making more room and more space. If people can't imagine the future, they will not go there with us, right? And helping folks imagine the future means helping them experience it right now in real time. not 10 years from now, but here, today, right now. And that means everyone has a right to be at the table. My liberation, Black liberation, is entwined with everyone being liberated. This is not about rebuilding silos. This is about opening a living room, an open space where all of us get to move together. So in short, tangibly, practice humility. Practice it every day. And practice it with those who are closest to you, right? The second is we don't get to choose who is inside and outside of our movements. We don't get to condemn people. We get to condemn and point out behavior, but we merely point out the behavior and we have to move on. We have to get over the top of this mountain. And that means being forgiving. And right now we are not a forgiving movement. The third, beyond humility and forgiveness, is willing to hold contradiction. We cannot be purist. This is not about orthodoxy. This is about finding our way forward. And that means there are contradictions. That means there is imperfection. But as we know, there's beauty in imperfection. Beauty and imperfection brings with it a host of a million different possibilities. So what I tell folks is to practice humility, practice forgiveness, and practice complication. Because quite frankly, many of us on this call have been in lots of movements and in lots of spaces, and we have to honestly reflect and say, if that's the future, right? Think about what those meetings look like, what they feel like, right? How you feel when you're speaking up, how much anxiety is there and isn't there. If that's the future we are offering folks, no one's going into the promised land with us. We have to make real the future for folks who aren't necessarily us. There are conservatives. There are folks who may not always necessarily agree on my ideology, but I bet we have 50 values that bring us together, that allow us to build intimacy across the lines of race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation. Right here in Portland, Oregon right now, we sit under smoke that is so thick that it is actually broken, right? The measurement of the air quality index. They no longer even know how to measure it. Racism, homophobia, right? The fear of the other is preventing our community from doing what it absolutely needs to do right now, which is to come together, right? People are so afraid to talk to one another. And the last thing we need to be doing in our own movements is replicating that fear at any level. Be kind to people. See their humanness. It is what ultimately identity politics is about. Identity politics weren't the finish line. Identity politics were created so that we be empowered enough to recognize our own humanity so that we could recognize the humanity in each other. That's what we need right now.
Thank you, Eric. I think we have time for just a couple of additional questions.
Quick.
You know, bringing us back here to what's happening in Rochester, we've had several questions in the chat box, right? I'm going to go with this one as a starting point. What message would you share with protesters and allies in cities like Rochester who are working for justice in response to police killings of Black people?
Yes. So the first thing I would say to them is thank you, right? Most demonstrations around the country have been largely nonviolent. And the message has been Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter, the idea that Black Lives Matters is not a complicated or controversial statement. I thank them for all the nights they have been out, for all the things that they have faced on behalf of Black lives. It is beautiful, and I've not ever witnessed anything like this in my lifetime. It makes me believe that indeed, this is my country too. I would share some things, and I share them with humility. I share this as a person who's been a victim of police violence. I share this as a person who has participated in nonviolent direct action, who's participated in marches, who's been the victim of brutality in some of those demonstrations. So I say this honestly. The first is we have to continually organize and bring into movement those who are on the streets marching. Emotions are one thing, but emotions do not take the place of organization. And so we need those leaders on the streets, and I know they are carrying so much right now. I know they are carrying a lot, and it's a lot to ask, but I need them to be even more leaderful in this moment. I need them to be able to bring those individuals who are out on the streets into their movements and into their organizations. For those who are kicking in windows or setting fires wherever, and I know it's a small group, I want to say to them, I understand the anger and I understand the alienation, but I have to tell you, nihilism is not the same as believing Black Lives Matter. And it has an impact. I'm not equating it with the loss of physical life, but neither am I going to be irresponsible enough to say that kicking in the windows of a small business owner doesn't have an emotional and mental impact. Audre Lorde taught us, Black feminist, right? And we cannot use the master's tools, right, to destroy the master's house. All we will do is to build another world full of violence. And so we have to draw the moral line. So I understand the anger, but we cannot use violence, not physical violence or the violence of property destruction. It does not help get Black people free. And for everyone else, I want to say, it's easy to point at the small acts of violence as an excuse for non-action, as a way of shifting the conversation. But I want to say this to all of us, and I include myself in this. If there are folks out there looting and engaging in physical violence, what type of society have we built where our generation behind us, our children, think that is the only way that they can be heard in this moment? What type of society have we built for them? We owe them something better. And owing them something better means delivering a real alternative to engagement. And that means resourcing those first leaders I talked about in the streets, the ones who are out there every night and every day. We have to support them. We don't have to agree with them 100%. We don't even have to agree with them 40% of the time. We just have to believe in the Constitution and the right to free assembly. And we have to believe that they too are trying to make a better world. And what they need right now is not our suspicion, not our finger pointing. What they need right now is our love, our wisdom, and our support. And so I say to all three of those groups, us, those who are breaking windows, and those leaders who are marching around on the streets right now, trying to bring organization, trying to bring real policy change, trying to change the consciousness of America, that it's the role of all of us to lean into one another right now. This is about our communities ultimately. And the tactics we use will dictate the type of community that we build. So let's be smart, let's be disciplined, let's take ourselves seriously.